We have a problem with global business, sweatshops, child labour, land grabs, oil spills, conflict minerals, deforestation, toxic waste. We have allowed corporations to grow incredibly powerful, yet at the same time, we have failed to put in place rules to prevent businesses from abusing human rights and causing environmental damage. And the Emerald Isle, the best little place in the world in which to do business? Well, we can actually be part of the solution if we make it our business. My name is Gary Walsh. I've spent the last 10 years working with Trócaire, an Irish international organisation that supports communities in their struggle against corporate abuse. I've seen firsthand the impact of irresponsible and unethical businesses, and I've met brave human rights and environmental defenders who are risking their lives to protect their land and communities against big business. Behind many of the things we take for granted are human rights abuses and environmental damage. The clothes we wear, the batteries in our electronics, the metals in our cars, the diamonds on our fingers, the palm oil in our snacks, the fruits we eat, the list goes on. We consumers have become complicit in the exploitation of people and planet. But the problem isn't simply to do with consumerism. The problem lies in a global system that allows corporations to dodge accountability for the harm that they cause. This needs to change. Over the last few decades, some of Europe's largest companies have been complicit in appalling human rights abuses across the globe. In 2013, the Rana Plaza building collapsed in Bangladesh. Over 1,000 people, mostly women, died in this shocking tragedy. Inside the building, people had been making clothes that would end up on the shelves of major high street clothing stores in Europe. This is just one of the most shocking examples of corporate harm that have made the headlines in recent years. Yet there are many more cases of abuses across other business sectors. What we're talking about isn't just a problem to do with huge global companies in faraway places. Indeed, this problem extends far closer to home than you might think. In fact, across Ireland and the UK, there are a number of companies that are making headlines, but for all the wrong reasons. For example, the Cerrejón mine in northern Colombia. It is accused of complicity in grave human rights abuses.
The mine is owned by Glencore, one of the largest mining companies in the world, which is listed on the London Stock Exchange in the UK.
Yet also in Ireland, the ESB, the state-owned energy company, has purchased millions of tons of coal from this mine. In 2019, Christian Aid published a report about the ESB and the Cerrejón coal mine. I met up with Christian Aid's Conor O'Neill to learn more about this case.
The Cerrejón mine is one of the largest open pit mines in the world, located in the northeast of Colombia. So the human rights abuses and environmental harms associated with the mine have been really well documented over a number of years by local communities and human rights and environmental organisations and activists. And this ranges from the displacement of people being slowly pushed off their land to make way for the mine and the company's activities. Some of the communities who've kind of stood up and resisted this have faced intimidation and threats and at times coercive environment that's made it very, very difficult for them to stay there. In the immediate sense as well, you have really serious environmental harms. So we're talking about pollution of the air, soil and water. So the impact is really severe, and it's something that's caused a lot of controversy for a number of years.
And Conan, can you tell me, what is the connection between the ESB here in Ireland and this notorious mine in Colombia?
So for over 2 decades, the ESB has imported millions of tons of coal from this mine, despite the fact that there have been so many public, very well documented and serious human rights abuses and harms associated with it. And it really matters that the coal that's being burned, or has been burned, down in Moneypoint Power Plant in County Clare, that has lit our homes and fueled the country, has been drawn along supply chains littered with really, really serious abuses and harms. And the communities that we work with and speak with in La Guajira, in the northeast of Colombia, they say we have a responsibility to question and ask where this coal is coming from, who has suffered to supply this coal that is fueling the country, and the responsibility we have for what's happening at Cerrejón.
And have you brought these human rights concerns to the attention of ESB?
Yeah, we have brought these human rights concerns to the ESB and engaged with them substantively, and really we don't think that the response so far has been sufficient. Generally, many companies who've been involved with the mine tend to point to what we see as flawed, non-transparent and industry-funded assessment initiatives that are supposed to really respond to these concerns, but they aren't really good enough.
Unfortunately, this case isn't unique. There are other companies operating on this island that are accused of complicity in human rights abuses across the globe. Take Airbnb, for example. It's the company that so many of us use when booking our holidays. Yet Airbnb is linked with Israeli human rights violations on Palestinian land. The company allows people to make bookings in properties located in Israeli settlements. Israeli settlements are built on land that has been stolen from Palestinians. They are completely illegal under international law and are a major violation of the rights of Palestinians. But what's the specific link to Ireland in all of this? Well, for customers in most countries, including Israel and occupied Palestinian territory, Airbnb runs its business through Airbnb Ireland UC, which is a Dublin-based company. One of the Palestinians impacted by Airbnb's actions is Auni Sha'eb. In 2018, Auni learned that Israeli settlers had built a house on his family's land in the West Bank, and that it was now available to rent by tourists on the Airbnb.com platform. In 1975, the Israeli settlement of Ofra was established by seizing part of these farmlands. As a result, he and his family can no longer tend to crops or even visit the land. While they can't even access the land, tourists from anywhere in the world can stay there. Auni best describes this situation when he says, "For someone to occupy your land, that's illegal. For someone to build on your land, to rent it out and profit from it, that is injustice itself."
To know more about how Israeli settlements impact the lives of Palestinians, I spoke to Asil Al-Bajja, who works for Al-Haq, a Palestinian human rights organisation and Trócaire partner.
Existing settlements means that your land has been stolen and that you have been displaced. The Israeli settler is not only illegally residing in your home, but works relentlessly to make your life unbearable by inflicting physical and psychological violence on you, your land and properties. Accompanying the settlement is a permanent infrastructure, including the annexation wall, military checkpoints, a permit system that not only impede our freedom of movement and our right to access to healthcare and education and employment, but impinge on our dignity as the indigenous people of this land. Israeli settlements means that we live in constant insecurity on our lives and safety. Israeli settlements are integral to how Israel entrenches its apartheid regime against the Palestinian people.
The reality is that by marketing its services in these Israeli settlements, Airbnb may find it impossible to mitigate or avoid being connected to these human rights abuses, because these activities take place on unlawfully seized land under conditions of ongoing discrimination and are connected to serious violations of international law.
It's not just human rights that are under attack from big business. Unregulated corporate power has played a huge role in the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis that our planet is now facing. The extractive industries, including fossil fuel companies who are key drivers of climate change, are taking over huge areas of land in developing countries, destroying the local environment in the pursuit of profit. One example of such environmental damage is in the Niger Delta, where the oil company Shell has been responsible for devastating oil spills since the 1950s. Over 6 decades, an estimated 11 million barrels of oil have been spilled in the Delta. These oil spills are having a devastating effect on the environment in the region. What affects the environment impacts people also. Environmental damage often goes hand in hand with harm to communities and their rights to their land, their forests, their rivers, and their health. According to Friends of the Earth, 16,000 children die every single year because of the pollution in the Niger Delta. Also, when you consider the fact that just 100 companies, including the largest oil, coal, and gas companies, are responsible for 70% of all global carbon emissions to date, it is clear that we cannot address the climate crisis without also addressing this issue of corporate accountability. Across the world, brave women and men are standing up against big business. They are defending their communities, defending their rights, defending the environment. But in doing so, many of them are risking their lives. Olive Moore works for Frontline Defenders, an NGO that helps to protect human rights defenders who are at risk across the globe. I met her in Dublin's Ivy Gardens.
So we're here at the Human Rights Defender Memorial. This is part of the Human Rights Defender Memorial project. This project was set up by Frontline Defenders in 2016, and it's a coalition of national, international organisations who are all working together to document killings of human rights defenders globally. So human rights defenders are ordinary people who work on lots of different issues like environmental rights, land rights, and they work to protect human rights. And because of the work that they do, and essentially because of the effectiveness of the work that they do, they're at risk.
Olive, can you explain to me the risks that human rights defenders are facing, particularly related to businesses and corporate exploitation and abuse?
So the ultimate risk that human rights defenders face is to be killed. But as well as killings, there are many other risks that they face. The risk of violence, the risk of harassment, the risk of imprisonment, detention, the risk of criminalisation, where they're being accused of crimes, unlawfully accused of crimes that they didn't commit in order to try and stop their work, threats to their family, defamation, smear campaigns. Women human rights defenders are more likely to experience gender-based violence, including sexual violence. They constantly face sexist rhetoric in their work and in what they do. They're more likely to experience smear campaigns, attempts to defame them, attempts to challenge their reputation and destroy their reputation in many cases. And they're more likely to face this online toxic abuse. As a result of their work, and particularly because they're women human rights defenders also are more threatened in relation to their families. And particularly if you're a mother human rights defender, children are threatened because that's seen as a really effective strategy to silence women human rights defenders.
In 2011, the United Nations introduced guidelines for how businesses should behave in order to respect human rights. But the problem is these guidelines are voluntary, so they can be ignored, and they are being ignored. At present, it's very easy for companies to wash their hands of responsibility when it comes to human rights abuses and environmental damage. The global value chains through which many companies operate allow them to do this. But what do I mean by a global value chain? Put very simply, it means the entire range of activities that are done to create a product from start to finish. It can include a wide range of business relationships across the globe, including suppliers, subcontractors, subsidiaries, and investors. A mobile phone, for example, may be produced by a Chinese multinational company using materials from Central Africa, while other services like design, manufacturing, packaging, and marketing might be done in Europe or the US. But what happens when human rights abuses or environmental damage take place in this chain? Let's say it's the use of child labour at the Central African mine where the metals for the phone's components are sourced. While the operators of the mine have an obligation to stop this, responsibility should also lie with the Chinese multinational to identify any abuses happening in their value chain. Unfortunately, as it stands, it's very easy for the Chinese multinational to not ask the difficult questions and avoid any accountability. They might claim that it's out of their control and that it's an issue for the mining company alone. The reality, though, is that companies often do have considerable control or influence over suppliers, subsidiaries, or business partners. It's simply not good enough for companies to wash their hands of responsibility when it comes to tackling abuses in their value chains. The problem is clear. Businesses are damaging the environment and trampling on people's rights. At the same time, people most affected have few avenues to seek justice. So how do we go about changing this situation? What actions can we take? What actions can our governments take? To find out, I spoke to my colleague Jeannie McCann, who is Trócaira's campaigns officer in Northern Ireland.
So yeah, people are becoming increasingly concerned about where their products are coming from, their impact on others, and the impact on the environment, and they're making consumer choices based on that. And that's something that's to be welcomed, and it's very positive. However, the reality is that ethical consumerism will only go so far. It puts the burden on us, the consumer, to take the responsibility for our purchases. We need to think of ourselves as more than just consumers. We need to think of ourselves as constituents who have the power and influence to urge our politicians, our elected representatives, to make laws which will hold companies to account for harming people on the planet anywhere in the world.
Well, the French give us a good insight into what this approach could look like. In 2017, France introduced the Duty of Vigilance law, which requires companies to identify and prevent human rights abuses and environmental harm in their value chains. I spoke to Swan Baumier. Swan is Advocacy Officer for CCFD, a French NGO that campaigned for the creation of this law.
It's a law that is reconnecting the headquarters of a company in France with its supply chain, its subsidiaries, and all its suppliers throughout the world. If there is a supplier or if there is a subsidiary of that French company involved in human rights or environmental violations in that country, and affected people don't have access to justice there, then they can come to France and have a say in French courts.
That's great. I mean, it's early days, but it sounds very positive that the law is being applied. Can you tell me a little bit, Swan, about how the law came about?
It's a process that has been in the making for years because the lobbying was very fierce against that law, because big corporations in France did not want to be held accountable for what they did abroad. Branding is magnificent, everything is super nice, but when you go behind the scenes, then sometimes the picture is very, very different. And they didn't want to be held accountable for that nightmare that some people are living because of their activities. So the French law on the duty of vigilance is really the outcome of public pressure, of the joint work of unions and NGOs to try to build a movement and try to make this issue an issue for everybody.
There is a growing global recognition that voluntary guidelines for business on human rights and the environment have failed.
So if we had a strong and effective law, a system here that mandated companies based in Ireland or operating Ireland to do real, thorough, comprehensive checks along their supply chains, it would go a long way to making sure that abuses like this don't take place. And that applies to a state-owned company like ESB, but indeed to any other company, and in particular, big multinationals operating here. And we have a responsibility to put a system like that in place, and we need to start working on it now.
What we need is a law, a duty of vigilance law that is adopted in the UK, in Ireland, in the US, in China, in Indonesia, wherever you think of, in the EU and at the UN.
Unsurprisingly, not everyone is in favour of tough laws. There is a strong corporate lobby that is happy with the current situation and is pushing back against the introduction of new rules for business. If the corporate lobby has its way, any new laws could be seriously watered down. It's essential, therefore, that ordinary people across this island put pressure on their governments to introduce strong corporate accountability laws. This means not just thinking about what we can do as consumers, but what we can do as constituents. Constituents who can demand action from our elected representatives. Without this public pressure on our politicians, it will continue to be business as usual. We need an end to land grabs, an end to attacks on human rights defenders, an end to violence against women. We need a world without forced labour and slave-like working conditions. We need to see our environment protected, where we stop deforestation, stop dumping of toxic waste, where we prevent oil spills, unchecked carbon emissions, and the destruction of biodiversity. Fundamentally, we need an end to corporate abuse of human rights and the environment, and we need our governments to make it their business to introduce tough new laws. But we also need you to make it your business to put pressure on them.